If you've ever felt slightly suffocated, you know how terrifying a feeling that can be. You actually start believing that death is nearing you with every strangulated breath you let out. Now imagine what this person went through. Being encased in a metal cylinder from the neck down, unable to see any part of his body. He had no idea what was happening because of the tent that surrounded his head. When the tent was taken off by a nurse, the boy finally got a chance to absorb all that was around him. Unfortunately, he was met with an even more horrifying scene. In an enormous, noisy ward were dozens of children like him who were also encased in these daunting metallic cylinders, and they were wailing from the pain they were in. Paul tried screaming for help. He tried to say something, but he realized that no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't able to do either. All he could do was watch as the children replaced one another in these gory cylinders. Some would come and die a few days later as others took their place. Some of them recovered too and were sent home, but unfortunately, Paul was still stuck in the cylinder. He could hear the nurse discuss his condition and his future as they pointed their fingers at him and whispered to each other in hushed tones that he would probably die today. This sad gossip only motivated him to live longer. He wanted to keep living despite it meaning that he had to remain in the cylinder for more and more time. He was a boy with dreams. He was a boy who didn't let his condition get the best of his enthusiasm. He actually dreamt of becoming president one day, but before setting out on a journey that would lead him to rule the country, he was most eager to leave the cylinder and the horrible ward it was in. After all, he had been stuck here for 18 whole months. This was longer than anyone else. Now, you must be wondering, what exactly is this cylinder? Why was Paul put in it, and why are there only 2 ways to exit it, and how did Paul even manage to get away from his captors? Well, sit tight, because in today's video we'll be telling you guys all about Paul Alexander and how he ended up in that weird metal cylinder. Hailing from Dallas, Texas, Paul was just like any other ordinary 6-year-old boy. In the unlucky summer of 1952, Paul fell victim to a terrible viral disease like hundreds of other children, called paralytic poliomyelitis. Around 60,000 cases of polio were reported that year, and more than 3,000 among these were fatal. The ones who didn't die still suffered because more than 20,000 people were left with disabilities in the wake of this outbreak. All public interaction places were shut down, including swimming pools, bowling alleys, and cafes. The streets were treated by an insecticide commonly known as DDT. School students had to be locked in their homes, and people were even hesitant to speak to their friends and neighbors. People were so afraid they thought the virus could travel through wires, so they stopped using phones altogether. This panic was also intensified by the realization that a vaccine wouldn't be available for the coming 3 years. Nobody had figured out at that time that polio enters a child's body only through the mucous membranes of the mouth, so the preventative measures kept proving ineffective. Paul, who was also unaware of this fact, just wanted to shrug off the day's heat after the rain, but he had to rush inside as he developed a sudden sharp pain in his head and neck. His mother put him to bed, all the while tending to him, but after spending 5 days in there, he slowly lost his ability to move, walk, swallow, and even his breathing started to deteriorate. He experienced these symptoms because the virus had progressed to his central nervous system. This in turn led to the death of cells that are vital to muscular mobility, and as far as we know, the respiratory system, though it functions passively, is dependent on muscular movements. And with the loss of ability to breathe, the need for an artificial lung developed. That's where the cylinder came in. It's also called the iron lung. This lung is basically an invention that creates a negative pressure and helps the patient in breathing. When the air is pushed in the cylinder by the bellows, it's also drawn into the patient's lungs. Meanwhile, as the pressure changes, the same air is forced out of the lungs of the patient and they're released. This, however, doesn't last forever. Paul might have been young, but even he figured out that there were only 2 ways to leave the machine. One was to recover, and the other was to die. But somehow nature had chosen Paul Alexander to be the exception, as he neither died nor recovered. The virus had left him completely paralyzed, and his paralysis had also spread to his lungs. It was obvious that the boy wasn't going to die, but his hospital stay was already prolonged, so he eventually had to be sent home. However, he could not leave the hospital without the 300-kilogram iron lung that was keeping him alive. This was a challenge for Paul's entire family, for they had to adjust with the humming noise of the machine that was now going to be a permanent part of their lives. Although the loud sound of the lung didn't turn out to be much of a problem, the real issue arose when it was silent. When the machine went silent, it meant Paul was not breathing, and it did go silent every time they were hit with a power outage. How did he breathe then? Well, Paul's parents had to manually pump the lung until the power came back on. They sometimes had to ask neighbors to help them, as it was a tiring process. Paul would encourage his own body to breathe in and hold on to each breath a little longer in such situations. He still remembered how at the hospital the nurses would bathe him and change his underwear. They would ask him to breathe in, then hold his breath. The boy was unable to do it for long and would pass out many a time. It was natural, owing to his circumstances, that Paul developed a disliking for doctors. However, he was quite fond of Mrs. Sullivan, the March of Dimes therapist. She taught him an alternative trick of breathing called glossopharyngeal breathing. It's a breathing technique where you're supposed to deliberately trap air in your mouth and push it down with the help of your tongue. It was also called frog breathing, and it truly did become one of the reasons he managed to survive this. His condition did not faze his aspirations. Paul was eager to study. He was an ambitious young man, and whatever he lacked in physical ability, he more than made up for in intellectual capabilities. He knew that intelligence was the only tool he could utilize to achieve something in life. But studying wasn't going to be an easy feat. After all, it requires certain activities like walking, attending classes, talking, and how was it going to be possible for him when he could not even breathe on his own? This is where Mrs. Sullivan knew she had to motivate him. She made him a deal that if he managed to make himself frog breathe for 3 minutes, she would give him a puppy. Of course, he accepted the challenge. All this time, his mother was tirelessly working to find any opportunity she could for her son to go back to school remotely. Surprisingly, in 1967, Paul Alexander graduated from high school and got all straight A's except in biology, where he got a B because he was unable to dissect a rat. On his graduation day, Paul's happiness was doubled when he became the proud owner of an adorable little dog he called Ginger. Ginger was his friend for 8 long years. This was all thanks to Mrs. Sullivan, who kept her word and got him Ginger when he was able to frog breathe for adequate amount of time. This helped him leave the cylinder for a while. He could come out on the porch and even walk around the yard for a bit. This wasn't enough though. He aspired for a greater purpose in life. Therefore, he decided to pursue his dream of becoming a lawyer. He wanted to travel and explore the world, maybe even find love during the process. Guys, just because he was physically different from other people didn't mean his emotions were too. This seemed like a far-fetched dream for him. No law school out there would accept Paul, and this wasn't because he didn't have the grades for it, but because he was deemed incapable. At the time, there was a severe lack of facilities for physically challenged people around the world. But this did not faze Paul's spirits. He persistently started calling the dean's phone at his school and kept doing it for 2 whole years until he got the answer he wanted. But the dean did not make it any easier for him, as Paul was supposed to fulfill 2 conditions if he wanted to join. He had to find a helper to get him to and from his classes, and the second was to get himself vaccinated against the polio virus, even though Paul didn't need the vaccine. However, many others needed it, so much that mass vaccination was a common sight around the cities at that time, as polio hadn't completely been eradicated. Americans were pretty afraid of the epidemic almost as much as they were afraid of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. Paul's perseverance deserves a standing ovation, as he managed to meet the conditions, and soon enough he was on the path to becoming a college student. Although he had to return to the iron lung at night, he was starting to feel normal, as he was able to enjoy normal life to some extent. He visited clubs and theatres, and even fell in love with this girl named Claire. They got engaged too, but this engagement never progressed to a marriage, as Claire's mother forced her to break the engagement off, for she could not bear the thought of her precious daughter becoming a lifetime nurse to a grown man with an 8-year-old's body. Previously, we've seen how Paul was a steadfast young man who knew how to get what he wanted, but this time he decided to back down and let her go. He didn't want to complicate Claire's life. This probably broke his heart because after this he started thinking about leaving Dallas. He transferred to the University of Texas, Austin against his parents' wishes. They were extremely worried about him and were concerned how he would manage to live on his own with his condition. But nothing could change Paul's decision as he hired himself a caregiver and moved into the campus with his metal lung. Unfortunately, by the time school started, his caregiver hadn't shown up, and Paul was taken care of by members of the university fraternity. They did it for another month before a new caregiver finally arrived. Despite being able to leave the machine for a few hours, Paul still required assistance to manage in the outside world. But like everything else, this failed to hinder the 40-year-old Paul Alexander. He put his mind to it, and finally the day arrived when he was in a courtroom wearing a three-piece suit and winning his case. His dream became a reality. The boy about whom the nurses used to say he would not make it to the next day made it through college, got a degree, became a lawyer, and even started his own practice. Paul somehow managed to live and work without paying much heed to the iron lung until the sad day it broke down. After all, the machine wasn't created from the perspective of continuously running for 70 years, but still it did manage to serve Paul for this long. In the year 2015, the worn-out cylinder seal caused an air leak. Why didn't Paul transition to any of the modern technology built for the same purpose, one may wonder? The reason is that the iron lung is the only device that produces a negative pressure opposing the atmospheric pressure, whereas all the latest equipment produces positive pressure. This would not be able to help Paul as his lungs had atrophied. Paul frequently used YouTube, and in a video message he told his subscribers that he had managed to find a mechanic who agreed to craft the vital parts of the machine manually because iron lungs have been out of production for decades now, and there was a thin chance of finding their parts. Paul is now 74 years old and has outlived almost everyone he knew, including his brother. So what if he wasn't able to break free from the iron lung permanently? It did become a legendary story that inspires many to greatness. In the year 2020, he left the lung and the country. He also authored a book called 3 Minutes for a Dog, which has inspired many worldwide. He truly is a miracle. If you enjoyed the inspiring story of Paul, do give your feedback in the comments and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with our latest releases. We can guarantee that you don't want to miss them. See you all next time.